Dark intentions at Dunkin' Donut. The fluorescent lights flicker above me as I sit on the edge of a narrow bed. The cold walls, the air thick with dust and time. It's been 2 years, but I remember it all as if it happened yesterday. The Dunkin' Donuts shop, the rain, and Jerry. That's where it all began. I worked the night shift at the Dunkin' Donuts in a quiet suburban town. It was a small place, nestled between an old laundromat and a thrift store. I saved what I could, putting money aside each night. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a job, and it kept me going. My sister usually stopped by, but tonight she wasn't there to see me. She was sitting by the window with a guy, her eyes red from crying. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but it was obvious they were arguing. She looked so distressed. He wore an old, worn coat, lingering at the door, watching the place. Tonight, he hesitated at the door, lingering longer than usual. I tried to keep my distance. There was something about him that made my skin crawl. I snapped out of my thoughts when the door creaked open, and Jerry walked in. He was irregular but always so strange. His habit of coming in at exactly 10 p.m. never failed. He shuffled to the counter, but his gaze shifted to my sister, now sitting alone, staring out the window. Jerry leaned in, asking me about her, asking if he could get her number. I clenched my jaw, trying to smile politely, but the sharpness in my voice slipped out. "Leave her alone, Jerry. Just order and go." He chuckled and said, all right, I'll have the usual." He ordered a chocolate donut and hot chocolate, which he always ordered, and went to his usual seat in the corner. I watched him eat, tearing tiny pieces off his donut, his eyes flicking toward me now and then, making me uneasy. My shift ended. It was pouring as I walked home, the streets deserted, but after a few blocks, I started hearing another set of footsteps, echoing mine, stopping when I stopped. I turned around, but no one was there, just the empty sidewalk stretching under the streetlights. I kept walking, faster, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I finally made it back to my apartment. I went into my bedroom, letting the silence envelop me. But then I saw him, Jerry, standing across the street, holding a radio. He just stood there, staring at me, the radio pressed to his ear. He pressed his head to it, then suddenly smashed it against his head with a blank, puzzled expression. Blood gushed from his head. I scrambled around the room for my phone to get help, but when I looked back, he was gone. I sat on my bed, staring out the window into the rainy night. Jerry's face kept flashing in my mind. I couldn't take it anymore. I was sick of seeing him every night. And then, a dark thought crept into my mind, and I felt an odd satisfaction as I imagined it unfolding. I needed to teach him a lesson, to make him understand he wasn't welcome. The next night, I returned to the shop, stopping at the back to grab some supplies. I picked up a box of donuts, carefully selecting a chocolate one, just like Jerry's usual order. I pulled a small vial from my pocket, a stimulant strong enough to paralyze him for a while. I injected it into the donut, the liquid vanishing into the soft pastry. I carefully placed the donut back in the box, my heart racing as I imagined Jerry's face when he realized what was happening. I returned home and watched the rain fall outside the window. The donut sat on the dresser, a reminder of the plan forming in my head. As I sat there, an odd sense of peace washed over me. I didn't know where this road would lead, but I knew one thing: I wouldn't have to see Jerry's face staring at me anymore. Wouldn't have to endure his unsettling presence lurking on the edges of my life. The next night, I returned to the counter, watching the quiet stream of customers come and go, my mind racing with the plan I had laid out. The donut box sat in the drawer, hidden away, with one specific donut prepared for Jerry. I spent the whole day thinking about it, rehearsing the moment in my mind. imagining his face when he realized what I had done. I checked the clock. Almost 10 p.m. The door opened, and Jerry walked in, moving with his usual unsettling calm. I noticed a new scar on his forehead, a reminder of his strange behavior the night before. He glanced at the menu, but his focus was entirely on me. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a wad of cash, throwing it directly at my face. I could feel my anger boiling inside from his action. I reached into the drawer and pulled out the box with the special donut inside. I took him to the table, keeping my face as neutral as possible. He accepted it with a smirk. Then I went back to waiting for what I wanted. I stood still, watching Jerry slowly move his hand to the plate and take out the donut I had prepared for him. He slowly picked it up and intended to enjoy it. I felt very satisfied and happy to be able to witness what was about to happen. I chuckled inside, but then suddenly his hand holding the cake stopped. He put it on the plate and looked away. My heart sank with disappointment. Then I saw the door open again. That's my sister. She was smiling, dressed a little more neatly than usual. When she approached the counter, then turned her eyes to Jerry, her face lit up. I stared in disbelief, piecing everything together as she looked over to his desk. Could it be that what I'm thinking right now is true? My sister said, her voice filled with excitement, "Adam, I want you to meet someone," and pointed to the table where Jerry was sitting. My sister went to his table. Then he started to act gallantly. I suddenly remembered that she also liked to eat chocolate cake. Then, with a distorted smile, he brought the cake to his mouth for my sister to eat. I felt like I was collapsing, and instead a surge of panic hit me. I ran to the table and stumbled, screaming in vain, "Stop!" I screamed, my voice cracking with desperation. Panic flooded the room as I knelt beside her, screaming, shaking her, hoping she'd wake up. Jerry knelt down too, his face showing real horror as he tried to help. He pressed down, trying CPR, but it was no use. She was unconscious, her face pale. That's when it hit me, had I misjudged him all along? I grabbed my phone, my hand shaking as I dialed for an ambulance, my mind reeling as I realized the gravity of what I had done. The ambulance arrived, and I followed as they loaded her into the back, the siren wailing as they sped toward the hospital. The waiting room was cold, sterile, and I sat there, numb, staring at the wall, my mind racing with guilt, fear, and regret. A doctor came out, his face grim. He told me she was alive, but barely. The drug I put in the donut was enough to paralyze her temporarily, but very dangerous. She might not walk again. If there had been more, she wouldn't have survived. Relief washed over me for only a brief moment before I saw the police step into the waiting room, their eyes fixed on me. They approached, and I could feel the weight of what was about to happen. The room was harshly lit, cold, and unwelcoming. They asked me questions, again and again, trying to piece together what had happened. I told them the truth, every detail, from Jerry's strange behavior to the plan I had laid out, unaware of the devastating consequences. The officer listened and told me I was lucky my sister was still alive. But I should not be mistaken, this was premeditated, and I would face the consequences. With the camera evidence and the plots I had schemed, I was now convicted, the weight of my actions bearing down on me as I was led away. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the door through the cold prison bars. The world seemed distant, but the memories of that night never left me. I wondered about my sister, hoping she had healed, hoping she had moved on, and maybe, someday, she would forgive me. Abandoned McDonald's. For the past few weeks, I had been planning a vlog to explore and uncover the rumors surrounding an abandoned McDonald's that had been circulating for years, stories of massacres and unsolved crimes. Today, I finally made it here. As I drove towards it, my hands trembled with excitement, though the thought of experiencing it was pretty terrifying. But I believed that if this video went live, it would break all records on my channel. I arrived. It was truly an abandoned store, with peeling paint and dust-caked, grimy windows, giving it a very eerie feel. I took a deep breath and prepared to step through the door to explore. Inside, everything was eerily silent. The floor was dotted with patches of mold. The tables and chairs were arranged neatly, but covered with a thick layer of dust. I scanned my camera over the dining area, trying to capture every detail. The old menu was still there, faded and barely legible, just like the posters on the wall, all rotting from years of abandonment. I made my way towards the kitchen. Familiar machines like the ice cream maker and deep fryers were still there, but none of them were intact, all rusted beyond repair. Behind the counter, there was a large black mold patch on the floor. It sent shivers down my spine, as if someone had lain there for so long that their body had decomposed into the floor. I had heard rumors that the police once found a body here. I moved forward, trying to ignore the growing unease within me. I headed towards the restroom, just as my flashlight began to flicker. Suddenly, I felt something, a figure behind me. Startled, I turned around, only to see a Ronald McDonald statue grinning back at me. It didn't look anything like I remembered from my childhood. I forced a nervous laugh. I told myself it was just a statue, nothing to worry about. I continued, leaving the strange figure behind, heading towards the restroom. As I reached the restroom door, a musty smell hit my nose, but I pushed the door open anyway. I wanted to confirm a rumor that a killer had hidden a body here. I didn't know if it was true. I walked inside. There wasn't anything too unusual, just an old restroom, fairly spacious, covered in spots of stubborn moss. I felt a small sense of relief. I began panning the camera around every corner of the restroom. Maybe this place wasn't haunted like everyone said. In the end, rumors were just rumors. I left the room, but I couldn't shake off a strange feeling like I wasn't the only one here. My eyes darted to the floor, and I noticed dark stains that I hadn't seen before. I moved closer to capture them clearly on camera. Suddenly, I tripped, dropping the camera. As I bent down to pick it up, instinctively, I looked up and saw a horrifying sight right before my eyes. Hanging from the ceiling, there was a body suspended in the air, the red uniform with the unmistakable golden arches. It was a McDonald's employee. Her face was gaunt, her eye sockets empty and black, with long hair and arms swaying loosely from the ceiling. I needed to get out. My hands shook as I scrambled to grab my camera as quickly as possible. I had to leave, and fast. Now I believed the rumors were true. This place was haunted, cursed. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I found a police station. I told them everything, handed over my camera, and waited for them to investigate. When the police searched the restaurant, they found nothing. But what about the footage on my camera? I reviewed all the footage of the restaurant, the kitchen, the restroom, everything was there. But when it got to the part with the Ronald McDonald statue, there was no statue at all. The terrifying scenes I had witnessed, none of it was in the video. I was left speechless, with no explanation. The mystery of the dolls. Her name is Mari. She was on her way to Manor Street, covered in thick fog. Siri's voice alerted, "You have arrived at your destination." The silhouette of the mansion slowly emerged from the fog. Perched on a hill, surrounded by strange 18th century architecture, it looked like something from a nightmare, making her uneasy. She parked her car a block away and walked the rest of the way. The Coopers were an old, wealthy family, and tonight, she was babysitting their 10-year-old daughter. Mrs. Cooper had explained over the phone that their regular babysitter had an emergency, and they were willing to pay her triple her usual rate. The offer was too generous to refuse. As soon as she stepped in, Mrs. Cooper, a pale and frail woman, greeted her on the porch with a forced smile. She told her, "Bridget is upstairs. I've left instructions on the table. Please, don't bother her too much." Mrs. Cooper kept glancing around, as if there was something she couldn't tell Mari. Mari walked down the dark, seemingly endless hallway. She followed the instructions left for her, leading to the room at the end of the corridor. When she entered, she saw Bridget sitting in the middle of the room. Her large black eyes seemed too old for her face. She was clutching a porcelain doll, its face eerily lifelike. She greeted Bridget, but Bridget remained silent, her eyes fixed on the doll. The room was filled with dolls, porcelain faces, shiny hair, all meticulously arranged around the room. Mari shuddered at how real their hair looked. She tried to engage Bridget with stories and games, but the girl remained eerily silent. Hours passed in strange silence until finally, around 10 p.m., Bridget said she was sleepy. Mari led Bridget to the bedroom, and that's when she noticed something was wrong. The girl began moving toward the dolls, saying, "They are my slaves." She could hardly believe her ears. She never expected something like that to come from a child. She knew she needed to keep a closer eye on the girl. By 2 a.m., she had dozed off on the couch. A sudden noise startled her awake. She groggily rubbed her eyes, trying to make sense of everything, when she realized someone was standing behind her. She thought it was Bridget. She couldn't believe her eyes. The girl's face was twisted, her features deformed, aging grotesquely. She clutched the doll tightly in her hands and muttered, "I like your eyes. I will have them." Fear gripped her as Bridget lunged at her with an unnatural strength for a child. She fell to the floor, the weight of Bridget's small body pinning her down. She screamed in vain as Bree's hands scratched her face. "I will take your eyes," Bridget hissed, her voice rasping as if it belonged to someone else. The girl began pulling at a handful of her hair wildly, gleefully. With all her strength, she shoved the child off. She ran down the long hallway, glancing back to see Bridget enraged, chasing her madly. In desperation, she grabbed a decorative figure from a side table and hurled it at Bridget. It struck her forehead, and Bridget screamed in pain, staggering back. But it wasn't enough to stop her. She ran until she burst through the front door, flagging down a passing car. The driver, alarmed by her disheveled appearance, helped her get to the nearest police station. When she returned to the mansion with the police, the truth revealed was more horrifying than anything she could have imagined. Bridget wasn't a little girl. The woman she had been babysitting was a dwarf, Mrs. C., Cooper's deformed sister, whose body never grew but whose mind had twisted into something monstrous over the years. She often comes to the mansion, kills them in their sleep, and collects what she likes. But what she likes the most is their hair. She will use it to make dolls. The police uncovered 7 bodies in the backyard, all young women, all missing their hair. The porcelain dolls in Bridget's room were adorned with their scalps, their hair meticulously attached to the dolls she called her slaves. Mrs. Cooper had been covering up her sister's crimes for years, burying the bodies and protecting her in some inexplicable way. The police arrested both women. She now sat in her small apartment, still haunted by the events of that night. She no longer babysat, and just the sight of a doll made her heart race. The memory of Bridget still haunted her dreams. Stalked by the clown at the chicken shop. I was working full-time at a chicken shop. Not exactly the job I wanted, but it was enough to get by. Most evenings, I survived on leftover chicken, and then, that Saturday night happened. It had been a long and exhausting day. The restaurant was packed from morning until late at night. As I was cleaning up, my feet aching, I noticed him sitting alone at a table in the corner, waving frantically. At first, I thought he wanted to order, so I walked over, trying to smile. But as I got closer, I realized he wasn't a normal customer. He was a mime, grinning widely, dressed in the classic black and white striped outfit, his face painted ghostly white. He didn't say a word. He just performed. I guessed he wanted chicken and fries, so I handed him the food without thinking much about it. I was too tired to care. His expression twisted with irritation the moment I gave him the tray. His grin morphed into a frown. He suddenly stood up and threw a few fake punches into the air like a boxer. Exhaustion overwhelmed me. I told him to leave, but his face darkened even more. Slowly, he raised his hand, mimicking the act of pulling something invisible from his back. He stared at me without blinking, slashing the air with the invisible object. I played along, pretending to throw an imaginary stone at him. He staggered back, clutching his head as if I had struck him, then dashed out the door. I laughed at the absurdity of it. I thought it was harmless, but I was wrong. That night, my colleague and I were walking home together. I told him about the mime, and we laughed as we walked. But as we approached the building, I saw something, or rather, someone standing in the shadows of the hallway. A figure, dressed like the mime. I froze, staring, but chalked it up to my tired imagination. A few days later, after another late shift, I stepped outside. I walked home alone, the cold wind biting into my skin. When I finally reached my apartment, I collapsed onto my bed, not even bothering to change out of my uniform. As soon as my head hit the pillow, the doorbell yanked me out of my restless sleep. Groggily, I dragged myself to the door and peered through the peephole. It was the colleague I usually walked home with. He wore his usual green beanie, but stood with his back to the door. I mumbled as I unlocked the door. "Did you forget something again?" But when I opened it, it wasn't him. It was the mime, his face painted ghostly white, grinning at me, his eyes gleaming with malice. He bowed and slipped past me without a word, heading straight for the bag of leftover chicken on my table. I stood there, frozen, as the mime rummaged through the bag. He pulled out a chicken leg, took huge bites, chewing slowly, savoring it like some twisted parody of a meal. Then his eyes lit up. He turned to me, mimicking the act of dipping fries in ketchup, grinning like a madman. I couldn't take it anymore. I rushed over, snatched the food from his hand, and yelled at him to leave. His expression darkened. He slowly reached behind his back, pulling out the invisible knife he had shown me earlier. Only this time, it wasn't imaginary. Luckily, I reacted just in time, and it only grazed my arm, leaving a small cut. I bolted out of the room, blood dripping down the hallway. I could hear his footsteps behind me, faster, closer. In my panic, I fumbled with the buttons, desperately pressing the close button as he charged toward me. At the last second, the elevator doors closed. I collapsed to the floor, shaking, my vision blurred from pain and fear. The elevator doors finally opened in the lobby, and I staggered out, barely able to stand. My voice trembled as I called for help, and a passerby rushed over, eyes wide with fear. Someone had called 911. When the police arrived, after an hour of investigation, they told me they had searched the building but found no one matching my description, and the security footage had disappeared. He held up an evidence bag. Inside was the knife, but there were no fingerprints. They couldn't find him, but the weapon was proof that it had happened. After that, I moved away and quit my job. I couldn't step foot in that store again. But even now, I wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, hands shaking, and every time I see him in the corner of the room, grinning, holding that bag of chicken. Night shift nightmare. Jen was sitting at the dimly lit reception desk, trying to stay awake. She was checking the computer, reviewing her work, when suddenly, she felt someone lightly tap her on the shoulder. Startled, she turned around but found no one there. Worried, she chuckled, dismissing it as fatigue in her imagination. But a few minutes later, she felt a light but distinct tug at her hair. She froze, her hand slowly moving to the back of her head. The vague sensation of fingers lingered, as if someone was right behind her, almost unseen. She suddenly turned around again, but there was nothing. Then a book on the far end of the desk fell to the ground with a loud thud. As she shifted in her chair, Jen jumped. She focused on the book on the floor, the silence enveloping her. She shook her head to clear it and tried to brush it aside. She walked to the break room to collect herself. As she poured coffee into her cup, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, as if eyes were staring at her from the dark corner of the room. At 3:30 a.m., Jen returned to the lobby, sitting back at her desk, clutching her coffee cup. She checked the security cameras on her computer screen. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. She jumped up, quickly glancing outside through the glass, but only her own reflection stared back. Her hand lingered on the doorknob, uncertain. After a tense few seconds, she unlocked it, cracked it open, and peered outside. The night air was cold and empty. Jen closed the door and returned to her desk. Trying to shake off her fear, Jenna grabbed some cleaning supplies and headed toward the pool area as requested by her manager. Her footsteps echoed as she approached the edge of the pool. Just then, she noticed a faint outline of wet footprints, as if someone had recently walked through. She fearfully brushed past it, ignoring it as if she had never seen it, and continued with her work. She bent down to pick up a few scattered leaves, floating on the surface of the water. At that moment, she felt it, a strange sensation as if a dark shadow was lurking just beneath the surface of the pool. She hurriedly tried to leave, but before she could react, something yanked hard at her ankle, pulling her down into the pool. Jen lost her balance and fell into the cold water, her body soaked. Panicked, she felt as if she were drowning. She began to flail, sputtering water, then staggered out of the pool, trembling and looking around in confusion, not understanding what was happening. Jen struggled against an invisible force, her hands clawing at the pool's edge, but she was held tightly by a weight she couldn't comprehend. Her vision began to fade when she suddenly saw a woman raising a skeletal hand, pointing directly at her, saying something like, "I hate you all," before vanishing. Just as she was about to lose consciousness, Jen summoned her last bit of strength to escape, gasping for air as she surfaced. Hair disheveled and soaked, Jen stammered as she recounted what had happened by the pool to her manager. She tried to explain how real that feeling had been, but her manager merely checked the cameras and remained skeptical. He insisted that perhaps she just slipped. To her, it was different. She knew it was more than just a slip. Back at the reception desk, Jenna sat there exhausted. She felt foolish and paranoid, wondering if her fear was just in her head, fueled by her coworkers' ghost stories. Her gaze scanned the security cameras, but she hesitated, afraid of what she might see. She quickly packed her things, not wanting to spend another minute in the building. Her shift was about to end. Jen walked out suddenly. The doorbell rang softly in the empty lobby. Her eyes glanced toward the hotel. She held her breath as she watched the front door slowly open, revealing darkness inside as if someone was standing there. But she thought it was enough and turned around to leave immediately. As she drove home, Jen realized she would have to return to work the next day. The haunting spirit would be waiting, and the cycle of fear might never end. She needed to confirm this truth. Night shift nightmare. The next day, Jen stood behind the dimly lit reception desk, her hands slightly trembling as she stared at the empty lobby. The memory of the ghostly encounter lingered in her mind, but she pushed it aside, reminding herself that she needed this job. Jen reluctantly walked towards the pool area. The flickering lights cast strange shadows, making the room feel even more frightening. She glanced at the water, fearing the woman would reappear. But the pool remained still, the surface undisturbed. Jen took a deep breath, regaining her composure for the cleaning task ahead. As she began cleaning the pool, Jen's eyes scanned the area. She didn't see the ghost. Instead, her gaze fell upon a room she had almost never noticed before, peeking out from behind a dusty curtain. She stepped inside, her eyes landing on a pile of old papers stored in the corner. Curiosity sparked. She approached and began sifting through the dust-covered documents. Among them, an old article caught her eye. The headline read, "Mysterious Murder at the Hotel. Night Staff Member Missing." The article recounted an incident nearly a year prior, where a woman was brutally murdered by one of the hotel's night staff during a blackout. The next morning, the disfigured body of the woman was found with a flower pinned to her dress, but there was no sign of the staff member responsible for the crime. Jenna's mind raced as she processed this information, piecing together the fragments of a tragic story. Determined to shake off her fear, Jen continued her work. But as she bent down to pick up leaves, she felt someone behind her. She hesitated, fear enveloping her. Standing upright, she glanced around the empty pool area, but saw nothing. Jen continued to finish her cleaning, but once again, she caught sight of a dark shadow on the water. She turned around, but it was too late. The ghost was right behind her. An eerie smile stretched across her distorted face. Jen staggered back, the ghost's laughter echoing in her ears as she was drawn into the pool. The world around her felt like an endless abyss. Jen panicked as she emerged from the water, gasping for air. It stood at the edge of the pool, looking at her with a delighted and smug expression. Soaked and gasping, Jen burst through the door. She headed toward the reception desk, ready to leave the nightmare behind. But as she reached for her bag, she hesitated. She recalled the wronged woman she had seen in the article had also gone missing right there. Could it be her? What if that woman needed her help? The thought lingered, gnawing at her conscience. After much inner turmoil, she decided to return. Upon reaching the pool again, Jen looked around and saw the woman standing at the edge. But then she shouted, "I will help you find him." Jen could see the woman's expression change. She slowly reached out, brushing her icy fingers across Jen's forehead. Images flooded Jen's mind. Flashes of the night of the murder, the struggle, the fear in the woman's eyes. And finally, the face of the night staff, a dim shadow emerging. She returned to the reception desk. Using the hotel's security system, Jen searched for anything unusual, scanning the old footage from that fateful night, but most of it had been nearly erased. However, he missed one scene, him entering through the back door, with small dirt clumps still scattered on the ground. It led to the large abandoned area behind the building. The next day, Jen began searching for hidden evidence. Following the woman's memories, she rummaged through the abandoned land behind the hotel. Jen continued to dig. She discovered broken branches and leftover, but nothing resembling the evidence she sought. She felt like giving up. On the second night, Jen dreamed of the ghost, her distorted face contorted in pain. She was determined to return. After nearly 2 exhausting days, just as despair threatened to consume her, Jen's shovel struck something. She dug deeper, discovering an old box. When she opened it, she found the murder weapon, a knife, and a USB that he had hidden away, intending to destroy it. He seemed to have toyed with the law, disregarding it. Jen hurried to the police station. She presented the evidence she had found. With the evidence in hand, he was identified. After so long, he was finally apprehended. Jen felt the weight lifted off her shoulders. The ghost of the woman appeared behind her, a faint smile on her distorted face. Jen returned, knowing that the woman's soul could finally find peace. She glanced back at the building, but this time she felt it had truly closed. We met a crazy clown in the woods. In the summer of 2016, amid bizarre clown sightings across the USA, I stayed at our friend Milo's house, which bordered a dense forest. After a day of movies and snacks, we felt restless and decided to take a late-night walk. Armed with flashlights, we ventured into the forest at 2 a.m., our conversation mingling with the sounds of the night. By 2:45 a.m., we reached a clearing with an old, creaky playground until Milo pointed towards the old restroom building. There, partially illuminated by our flashlights, stood a man in a tattered blood red clown suit. Unlike the playful clowns from childhood, this one was menacing. His face was pale, with smudged makeup and a wide, eerie grin. His hair was a tangled mess of red and black. Paralyzed with fear, we watched as the clown stared at us, his head tilted to one side. Then, he started walking towards us, slow but deliberate. Panic surged through us, and we instinctively backed away, trying to decide whether to flee or confront the figure. Suddenly, the clown broke into a sprint.
Help me!
That was all the motivation we needed. We turned and ran as fast as we could back towards Milo's house, the forest path a blur beneath our feet. After what felt like an eternity, we burst out of the forest and onto the road in front of Milo's house. We glanced back and saw the clown standing at the forest's edge, partially illuminated by the streetlight. He had stopped running but was still watching us, his sinister grin visible even from a distance. In his hand, he held a big rusty axe. We didn't wait to see what he would do next. We bolted into Milo's house, slamming the door shut behind us. Milo's parents were out of town, so it was just the two of us, alone and terrified. We gathered in the living room, each of us trying to catch our breath and process what had just happened. Milo turned on the front door camera, and we watched the screen in tense silence. The clown appeared at the edge of the frame, walking slowly down the street towards the house. He stopped in front of the gate, looking around as if searching for something. My heart sank as he approached the front door, his gaze fixed on the camera. He leaned in close, his face filling the screen, and made a series of grotesque, mocking gestures. He waved the knife slowly before stepping back and disappearing down the street. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, too scared to sleep. The image of the clown's twisted grin and the knife haunted our thoughts. We didn't tell anyone about the encounter, fearing disbelief or ridicule. To this day, the memory of that night lingers, a chilling reminder of how a seemingly innocent adventure can turn into a nightmare. We often wonder what might have happened if we hadn't run back to Milo's house, and the unsettling question of who, or what, the clown continues to haunt us. Mysterious Treehouse. Through the dense foliage, the silhouette of a massive, weathered treehouse emerged. The house was large, its wooden structure warped and covered in vines. The treehouse seemed forgotten by time, hidden by the surrounding forest. We had been walking for hours through the forest, the trees becoming denser the deeper we went. Everything started with my friend Cody's dog. Oddly, it had gone missing for 5 days, then returned home with a strange piece of paper in its mouth. The paper looked like a toy treasure map, so I was intrigued. Cody started climbing the ladder nailed to the tree, and from above, he called down to me, telling me to hurry up and see something. I hesitated for a moment because the house seemed suspicious and strange, but I decided to follow Cody. I slowly climbed the rickety ladder to the treehouse. The closer I got, the worse the feeling became. Now, I could see the house more clearly. Through the broken windows, I could see inside the house. It was a mess, full of dust and scattered objects, yet it felt oddly alive. It was like a place of exile. The air inside the treehouse was stifling, thick with dust and an unpleasant stench. I began to look around and noticed the mess tattered old clothes scattered across the floor. In one corner, there was a mattress, stained with something black and terrible. As we moved further in, we saw the glimpse of a large, rusted iron cage among the debris. It seemed like no one had been here for years. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and told Cody.
There's nothing here. We should leave.
But Cody wouldn't listen. He was rummaging near the cage, curious, when suddenly he froze. His eyes widened, and his face turned pale as he said,
"We need to go. Now."
Before I could ask what happened, I heard it, a voice from below, low and raspy, full of malice. Well, look who I found. I glanced out the window. A man was standing at the base of the tree, looking up at us with a sinister grin. His face was gaunt, his eyes wild, his hair long and dirty, as if he had been living in the forest for too long. Cody wasted no time and shouted,
"My dad's a cop. He's coming any minute."
The man's grin faded, and his eyes narrowed as he started to threaten that if we were lying, he wouldn't spare us. Cody was below, near the ladder, ready to run, but I was stuck because the rope ladder behind his house was about to break. If he comes up here, I won't have anywhere to go. I backed away from the window, inching closer to where the cage appeared in the darkness. My legs were shaking so badly I thought I might collapse. My back hit the cold metal of the cage, and I felt something move behind me. Something alive. I slowly turned around. Inside the cage, huddled in the shadows, was a person, but it looked more like a monster. Its skeletal frame was twisted and deformed, with ashen gray skin. Its eyes were bloodshot and wild. The creature stirred, its head slowly rising as it turned towards me, opening its mouth and reaching out as if to attack. My body froze, paralyzed with fear. I couldn't breathe. Cody called me out of there immediately, and without thinking, I rushed towards the ladder in front of the house, decided to climb down regardless of what was waiting for me down there. Courageous Cody used his entire body to stop that crazy guy from running towards me. Cody said run to my parents, and they'll know what to do. I'm worried, and he's behind. He told me to go quickly and come back. I followed the instructions and ran as fast as I could. I have to save him. Cody stayed behind, and I don't know if I'll ever see him again. When the police arrived, everything was gone, and there was no trace of anyone. 10 years have passed since that day. I never went back to the treehouse until now. The memories came flooding back as I stood at the edge of the forest, looking up at the towering oak where the treehouse still stood, weathered and decaying. The haunting of the abandoned station. It was a chilly autumn evening in our small town. Inside the diner, warmth enveloped me. Sarah, my girlfriend, was finishing her cup of coffee. We had been dating for a few months, and tonight seemed like the perfect opportunity for an adventure since we both enjoyed that. After dinner, we decided to explore the old abandoned train station in town. The train station loomed before us. Built in the early 1900s, it had once been the heart of our town, but now it lay in ruins, overtaken by nature. My heart raced, but I didn't want to show fear in front of Sarah. I reassured her, even though I felt a hint of doubt creeping in. She began glancing around nervously and told me she felt something was off. Then, from afar, we heard a faint whistle echoing through the air. Sarah asked me, "There are no trains running here anymore, right?" I only knew that no trains had run here for decades. The whistle grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of wheels clattering on metal tracks. Sarah tightened her grip on my arm. "We need to go right now," she urged, panic rising in her voice. But somehow I lost control, as if mesmerized by the sound, stepping closer to the edge of the platform, staring down the empty tracks. The sound grew louder, yet no train was in sight, just the tracks stretching infinitely into the darkness. Then, as if summoned from nowhere, a blinding beam of light appeared, racing toward us. It approached quickly, gliding down the tracks like a ghost, but something was off. That light wasn't attached to any train. It hovered. Sarah screamed, urging me to stop, pulling me back just as the invisible train roared past. Its force nearly knocked us over, the platform shaking violently. For a moment, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, the station was silent again, the air heavy and still. Distant sounds returned, but something had changed. Sarah was gone. "Sarah," I called, panic rising within me. I searched for her frantically. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing on the tracks, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, its eyes glowing red like embers in the dark. A chill ran down my spine as it raised its hand, pointing down the tracks. Far down the tracks, I saw Sarah, walking away from me. But she wasn't walking normally. Her movements were stiff, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. "Sarah, stop," I yelled. But my voice echoed back, swallowed by the night. I ran toward her, desperation driving each of my steps. The closer I got, the more horrific reality became. Her face was blank, expressionless, her eyes vacant and soulless. It was as if her very soul had been drained. Tears streamed down my face as I reached for her, but the distance between us never closed. The shadowy figure at the station let out a raspy laugh, echoing through the trees, sending waves of fear crashing over me. I turned to face the figure, but it had vanished. In its place stood an old, rusted, decaying train, its windows shattered. Shadowy figures filled the cars, their hollow eyes staring at me. The door creaked open, like an invitation into the darkness. My heart raced with fear and curiosity. A whisper brushed my ear. "Join us. We've always been here waiting for you." I shook my head, backing away, but the pull of the train was too strong. My legs moved on their own, drawing me toward the door. Just as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. The train swayed, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I turned to see Sarah sitting across from me, her eyes vacant. "What's happening?" I choked out, but she didn't respond. Instead, she slowly raised her hand and pointed out the window. I looked outside. I was standing on the platform, staring at the train. But how could this be? I was inside. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The train raced faster and faster, the outside world fading into a blur in whispers. Suddenly, it stopped, and the door creaked open. Then, that dark figure appeared inside the train, leaning in close, its cold breath chilling me to the bone. "You should never have come here," it whispered, and everything went dark. When I awoke, I was lying on the cold ground, the train and station gone. All that remained was an empty field overgrown with weeds, a stark contrast to the horror I had just endured. I stood up, dazed and disoriented, and headed back to town. As I neared the town square, something caught my eye, a missing person poster. It was Sarah's face, but the date was from 10 years ago. My heart sank as I stumbled back, trying to comprehend the horror. Had I really been gone for 10 years? Or had Sarah vanished long before I ever met her? The truth was too horrific to grasp. Desperate for answers, I rushed back to the station, but when I arrived, it was gone. Only an empty field remained. The train, the darkness, the station all vanished as if they had never existed. Memories flooded back the faces of victims, broken families, the whispers of those who had vanished without a trace. Each shadow symbolized a haunting reminder of what I had escaped, of the guilt I carried for failing to protect those who needed me most. I turned away and walked on, ready to embrace the memories instead of fleeing from them. The shadows may linger, but I would no longer let them control my life. Run away from the stalker. It was one of those summer nights where the air was still, and everything seemed eerily quiet. The large, suburban house, with its perfectly trimmed lawn, stood imposingly. Inside, Chase and I had no idea of the terror about to unfold. I was 15 at the time, hanging out at my friend Chase's house. His parents were out, and we were home alone. The basement was every kid's dream. A TV, a pool table, video games. It was the kind of place that made you forget the world outside, and we were living the dream. We lounged on a big leather couch, watching a horror movie on TV, munching on chips. Chase had started to doze off. I was struggling with my own unease, the kind of anxiety I often felt when sleeping over at a friend's house. But tonight, it felt different. It was much worse. It must have been past midnight when I heard it. A door creaking open slowly. I glanced over the back of the couch and saw something unsettling. The laundry room door in the basement was wide open. I wanted to believe it was a trick of my mind, maybe just the wind, but I knew better. I quickly shook Chase awake. Chase, wake up. The laundry room door. It opened by itself. Chase, groggy and half asleep, mumbled something about it happening all the time and told me to go back to sleep. He didn't seem panicked, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling crawling down my spine. I insisted that we go close it together. We both got up and cautiously shut the door. Chase flopped back onto the couch, falling asleep within minutes. I tried to relax, but sleep didn't come easily. A while later, I woke up again, but this time, it wasn't a sound that startled me. Standing behind the couch, looking down at us, was a man. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The man was pale, sickly looking, with sunken eyes and an expression that was deeply unsettling. He stood there, motionless, just staring at us. I screamed, a sound that shattered the stillness of the night. Chase jolted awake, his eyes wide with horror as he saw the man advancing toward us. In our panic, we ran. The basement had two exits, one leading upstairs to the front door, the other to a sliding door at the patio. In our terror, we split up. I ran for the patio while Chase bolted up the stairs. Gasping for breath, I quickly called the police, shouting out the address and frantically explaining that someone had broken into the house. But Chase, I couldn't leave him behind. I circled the house, sneaking back in through the same door I had used to escape. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. It was too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I knew I had to find Chase. I moved as quietly as I could, climbing the stairs, each step creaking beneath me. The house was massive, and the silence was suffocating. Then I heard it, Chase's voice. His scream, a desperate, terrified scream for help. I bolted up the stairs, my legs trembling. At the top of the stairs, I saw the man, the intruder, wrapping his hands around Chase's neck, choking him, his face twisted in a grotesque expression. Chase's eyes were wide, his face flushed as he struggled to breathe. I grabbed the closest thing I could, a heavy sports trophy from Chase's room. Without thinking, I charged at the man. I swung the trophy with all my strength, smashing it into the back of the intruder's head. The man collapsed to the floor, and Chase fell with him, gasping for air, but alive. We didn't wait. We ran outside, not stopping until we reached Chase's treehouse. There, we hid, waiting for the sound of sirens. Chase was still trembling, rubbing his neck where the man's hands had gripped him just minutes earlier. We sat in silence, too afraid to speak. I looked out through the small window in the treehouse, scanning the yard for any sign of movement. The house looked eerily still, as if nothing had ever happened. Chase whispered, "What do we do now?" I had no answer. All I knew was that I couldn't let him go back inside. Suddenly, a faint rustling came from the direction of the house. I held my breath, straining to listen. At first, it was soft, like footsteps on grass. Then, I saw him, the man. He was slowly walking across the yard, his movements deliberate. His sunken eyes stared straight ahead, almost robotic, as he made his way toward the treehouse. I grabbed Chase's arm, pulling him away from the window. "He's coming." We both backed into the corner of the tiny treehouse, barely breathing. The man's footsteps grew louder. Now I could hear him, crunching on the gravel path leading to the treehouse ladder. The creaking of the ladder made me jump with fear. He was climbing. I could feel the weight of him pressing down on the structure as the treehouse swayed with each step. Chase looked at me, eyes wide with terror. I had to do something. I scanned the cramped space, frantically searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a rusty toolbox Chase's dad had left there months ago. I grabbed a metal rod nearby, gripping it tightly in my trembling hands. The man's hand appeared at the edge of the treehouse entrance, his fingers curling around the wooden frame. I swung the rod down with all my strength. The man let out a groan of pain, lost his balance, and fell backward off the ladder. He hit the ground hard. I grabbed Chase, and we scrambled down, running as fast as we could toward the house. My mind raced. Where could we go? The man had fallen, but he wasn't dead, and I knew it wouldn't be long before he got up again. Panting, I pulled Chase toward the side of the house, where thick bushes and overgrown trees hid us from view. We crouched down, trying to catch our breath. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance, the sound of tires crunching on gravel. It was the police. I whispered to Chase to wave for help. We stood cautiously, peering around the bushes. The man was nowhere to be seen. I signaled to Chase to follow me. We darted toward the driveway as the police car came to a stop. Relief washed over me as two officers stepped out, immediately scanning the area. I shouted, "He's still here!" "He's..." Before I could finish, a man emerged from the shadows, appearing from the side of the house. His movements were slower, more deliberate. Blood dripped from a gash on his head. The officers drew their weapons, ordering him to stop. But he didn't listen. He kept walking toward us, his eyes locked on Chase and me. The man ignored them, continuing his slow, deliberate walk. And then, without warning, he charged at us in a terrifying sprint. A gunshot from the police tore through the night. The man staggered, collapsing to the ground, gasping for breath. A wave of numbness washed over me. It was finally over. That night, as Chase and I sat in the police station, I learned that the man was a drifter, living in abandoned houses across the city. He was mentally unstable, with a history of violent behavior, But the most chilling detail? In his pocket, they found a crumpled old photograph. It was of Chase's house. The man had been watching us for a long time. Chase and I stood outside the police station, waiting for our parents to arrive. The terror of the night still weighed heavily on us. It served as a reminder that real horror doesn't always come from the darkness. Sometimes it's standing right behind you, watching. Stalker at the bus stop. A quiet and snowy Sunday evening. I was sitting at the bus stop, looking at my phone, and realized I had missed my bus. I started to shiver as the weather grew colder. Time passed slowly. I pulled out my phone again, put on my earphones, and selected a song to forget the uncomfortable cold. I looked around, realizing I was completely alone. No cars, no pedestrians, just an endless, empty street. Nearly an hour went by, and the bus was still nowhere in sight. I checked my phone again. The screen showed no updates on the bus's arrival, and the battery was dangerously low. A while later, I sensed some movement. A man wrapped in several layers of thick clothing, his face obscured by a knitted hood. The man walked with a strange, almost unsteady gait, as if he wasn't sure where he was going. I froze but tried to focus on my phone, not wanting to draw attention. The man approached the bus stop and sat at the opposite end of the bench. My discomfort grew. I glanced at the man, noticing part of his face exposed under the hood, a gaunt, pale face with eyes that seemed unfocused, distant. The man was muttering something to himself, his words slurred and incoherent. I shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something was off about this person. He moved closer, almost imperceptibly at first, but with each subtle shift, he inched toward me. My unease turned into panic as the man continued to slide closer, his gaze fixed on me in a strange, unsettling way. I felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, I felt the man's presence right next to me. The tension was unbearable. I quickly stood up, grabbed my bag, and started walking away from the bus stop. The man, still sitting there, tilted his head to the side, his eyes never leaving me as I walked away. I quickly walked away. I reached the next bus stop and finally felt somewhat relieved. I began to sit down slowly, letting my guard down a little as I waited for the bus. I closed my eyes for a moment, exhausted. The quiet of the falling snow was almost peaceful. Suddenly, a loud and rapid knock shattered the silence. My eyes shot open, my heart racing, and I slowly turned around to see the man from the previous bus stop, standing on the other side of the glass, his face pressed against it, grinning maniacally. His eyes were wide, staring straight at me without blinking. He kept knocking on the glass, his breath fogging up the surface. Panic flooded my body. I quickly stood up and backed away from the glass. The man began moving, circling around, his gait more erratic than before. His footsteps grew closer. I backed away, yelling at the man to stay away. However, the man was undeterred. He raised his hand, reaching out as if to do something to me. Luckily, I reacted just in time, darting off the sidewalk as the man lunged toward me. In a strange, inexplicable way, he slipped forward, his face slamming hard into the cold, icy pavement. The sound was horrifying. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It was so bizarre. I watched in horror as blood began to pool around the man's face, staining the snow with a deep red. My mind raced as I tried to process what had just occurred. I crouched down, attempting to get a response from him, but there was none. I sat down on the curb, my hands trembling as I pulled out my phone and called for help. The snow continued to fall, turning this bus stop into a place of horror and dread for me. The flashing lights of the ambulance and police car pierced through the night. Paramedics rushed to the man's side, but it was clear that something was very wrong with him. As the paramedics searched the man's belongings, they found a photograph in his wallet, a picture of the man with a boy who looked eerily similar to me. The police explained that the man had been on prescription drugs after losing his son, and his mental state had deteriorated ever since. I realized, with disbelief, that the man may have mistaken me for his lost son. A few days later, I took my driving test. As I drove, I glanced down the road where the bus stop was in the distance, the events of that night still haunting me deeply. I couldn't shake the sorrow of the man's grief and the terrifying experience that had unfolded. Horror Story Red Bracelet. I have worked at the hospital for 10 years, something I am very proud of. Most people I meet here have an average working time of just 1 year. The shortest time someone stayed was 1 week. Working here is not easy. They say staff are cursed if they do something wrong. Lights fall on people's heads, they slip on completely dry floors, and fires frequently break out. Patients sometimes become inexplicably violent. No matter how many times they inspect the building or add security staff, the employees always seem to be targeted by bad luck. Even after many years here, I don't know why, but I don't believe in that. I just try to do my best at work. Since working here, nothing unfortunate has ever happened to me. Sometimes I hear strange noises, but they are insignificant. I've gotten used to it and become resilient. One night after a late shift, I stepped into the elevator and immediately pressed the close button to slowly descend to the lobby from the 11th floor, alone. When it reached the 9th floor, the door opened. Reflexively, I reached out to press the close button but stopped when I saw someone standing there. It was a beautiful young girl I had never seen before, probably a new intern. Something about her made me want to talk and ask about her work. I placed my arm in the door to let her in. I asked if she was new. She shyly nodded without saying anything. I was very happy to get to know her. I saw her name tag. Her name was Ilsa. Every night after that, after my shift, at the same time on the 9th floor, Ilsa would be standing there waiting. This surprised me, but I thought it was just a coincidence. She didn't say anything, just bowed her head shy. For the first time in a long while, I decided to open up and make a new friend. One night, while going down in the elevator, as expected, the door opened on the 9th floor where Ilsa was waiting to get in. I decided to ask if she would like to have a drink with me. As soon as she stepped in, she heard a loud noise at the end of the hallway. Both of us looked out. From the corner of the hallway, a dark figure of a man appeared. He was tall, limping, and heading straight for the elevator.
Wait!
The man called out, "And now." She immediately reached out her hand to hold the door. The man sped up and shouted, "Help me! Help!" As the man got closer, my stomach began to churn. Wait, something wasn't right with me. The man was now just a few steps away from the elevator. He waved at us, revealing a red wristband that was bleeding. I immediately pulled Ilsa back and closed the elevator door. He pounded on the door continuously. I recalled the cold, clinical atmosphere of the morgue. The bodies lay on metal slabs, each with a red wristband. The image of a young girl's lifeless hand, limp from the weight of the wristband, flashed through his mind. His heart pounded, a mix of confusion and fear. The elevator swayed, bringing Jazz back to the present. He looked at Ilsa again. She slowly and coldly said,
"Why did you do that? Why didn't you help him?"
I replied,
I couldn't help him. He was wearing a red wristband, which is only for the deceased in the morgue.
She didn't speak. Then suddenly, she pressed the button to go down to the warehouse basement. Even I rarely go down there alone. I followed Ilsa down a narrow, dark corridor he hadn't noticed before. The walls were adorned with old, faded photos of patients and staff, all wearing red wristbands. The air grew colder. Then her hand fell down, revealing a red wristband. Her back was covered in numerous torn shirt marks. I froze, wondering what this was. Dizzy, dreaming perhaps. I started screaming loudly, and she gave me a horrifying smile. At that moment, all I could do was run for my life, and she kept slowly following me. When I reached the elevator door, I pressed the button frantically, uncontrollably. But the elevator didn't open. My breathing was so rapid I couldn't control it. I just stood there, eyes closed, praying. I held my breath because she was only a few meters behind me, walking slowly. Without waiting any longer, I had to find the emergency exit to run up to the first floor. I ran like I had never run before. Thank God I escaped that dreadful, terrifying place. I might have stayed there too long. It was probably time to leave. The next day, I quit my job. Years later, after I left, I learned that it had been officially abandoned without any explanation. It was a horrifying and unforgettable experience for me. The crazy man blocked the truck. It was a torrential, rainy day. After finishing a long, exhausting day at work, I drove my old, large truck back home. The windshield wipers battled against the pouring rain, moving in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. The radio crackled faintly, almost drowned out by the sound of rain pounding on the truck's metal body. The road ahead was nearly deserted, a winding path through a remote forest. Tall, ominous trees loomed on both sides, their branches reaching out like twisted, skeletal hands. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white from the cold. My eyes were focused on the road, but my gaze was weary, longing to be home soon. As I rounded a bend in the road, my headlights caught a figure standing in the middle of the road. Finding it strange, I drove a short distance further and then pulled over to the side of the road to rest for a moment. From a distance, there was that figure again. The silhouette was of a man, his hair disheveled and soaked by the rain. He stood motionless, his head slightly tilted to one side, staring straight at me with wide, unblinking eyes. His clothes were tattered and drenched, clinging to his gaunt frame. In his hand, he held something long, thin, and menacing under the headlights. My heart raced as I stared at the man, an instinctual sense of danger warning me. The man did not move, did not blink, just stood there, staring. My breath fogged up the window as I pondered what to do, making his already ominous figure appear even more distorted and terrifying. But before I could act, the man suddenly lunged forward, slamming his hand on the hood of the truck. The force of the impact made me jump out of my seat, my heart pounding. The man's face was now just inches from the windshield. His eyes were wild and bloodshot. I recoiled in horror as I realized the object in his hand was a long, sharp needle attached to a syringe filled with a murky yellow liquid. The man's mouth curled into a deranged smile, revealing yellowed and cracked teeth. He lifted the needle, tapping it lightly with his finger as if preparing to use it. He fumbled with the door lock, as if deliberately trying to frighten me. The rain outside seemed to grow louder, darkening the scene with a rising sense of dread. The man moved with terrifying speed. He lunged at the side door, yanking it open with astonishing strength. I could barely think, and there was no time to react before the man lunged at me. The syringe was raised, aimed straight at my neck. I struggled, adrenaline surging through my veins as I tried to push the man away. But his grip was like iron, his strength fueled by madness. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Who was this man? What did he want? Why was he doing this? The questions swirled in my head, but there were no answers, only a desperate need to survive. The man giggled, a high-pitched, maniacal sound. The needle inched closer. I twisted and turned, trying to evade it, but the man was relentless. In one final desperate move, I surged with a burst of life. I managed to grab the man's wrist. We wrestled, fighting for control. The man's eyes were wide and wild. His foul breath hit my face in a horrific gust. With gritted teeth, I mustered all my remaining strength and shoved the man back with a powerful force, sending him tumbling backward. The syringe fell to the ground, the needle shattering upon impact, the liquid inside spilling out and mixing with the rain. I slammed the door shut and locked it, breathing heavily, tense with fear. I watched as the man staggered to his feet. He let out a frustrated scream, his voice echoing through the empty forest. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I quickly shifted the truck into gear and hit the gas, the truck speeding away from the deranged man. Exhausted and shaken from the struggle, I drove in silence, quickly contacting the police about the incident and heading straight to the hospital. The man's wild eyes, his maniacal grin, the syringe filled with that strange liquid, they all haunted my mind. After the police investigated, they finally apprehended him and placed him in custody for psychiatric treatment. It turned out he wasn't just targeting me. He was after others as well, all as part of the twisted pleasure of a deranged mind. The Stalker. I worked as a cashier at a home improvement store, and my coworker, Nicole, quickly became my best friend. She was very sweet, a bit shy, and unfortunately, she was often hit on by customers. Most of the time, it was just harmless flirting or a dinner invitation that she politely declined. But one day, something different happened. Nicole told me about a man who had asked her out. She had declined, as usual, saying that she had a boyfriend. The man seemed irritated but left without causing any trouble. Later that day, he came back. Nicole was helping a customer, so I was alone at the counter when he approached me. He looked quite handsome, but there was something about him that made me feel uncomfortable. He spoke in a deep voice and said he was there to see Nicole. I asked how he knew her, and he lied, saying she had agreed to go out with him and that he was there to pick her up. I knew that wasn't true, so I told him she had already left, hoping he would go away. Instead, his expression darkened, and he crossed his arms, asking why he couldn't see her. Thinking quickly, I blurted out, "She's my fiancée." It was a lie, but it was the only thing I could think of to make him back off. His eyes narrowed, and he looked me up and down with disdain.
Someone like her with someone like you?
He scoffed at me. I held my ground, repeating that she wasn't available. He stared at me for a long moment before turning and leaving. I told Nicole what happened when she came back, and she felt creeped out but also found the fiancé excuse quite amusing. We laughed about it, thinking it was over. But 2 weeks later, the man returned, this time after dark. Nicole and I were closing up when we heard a loud bang on the glass door. We both jumped, and there he was, pressing his face against the glass, his eyes wild. "We're closed," I told him, but he didn't move. Nicole shouted at him to go away, but he just stared at us, his breath fogging up the glass. He pointed at me, his eyes full of rage. He yelled,
"I'm not here for her. I'm here for you. If I take out her husband, she'll be mine."
My heart pounded as I realized he intended to kill me. I told Nicole to run to the manager's office and call the police.
911, what's the emergency, please?
As she ran off, the man started ramming the doors, trying to break them down. I was terrified, but I knew I had to keep him outside. I grabbed a 2x4 from behind the counter, ready to defend myself if he got in. The glass doors shook violently, and I was sure they were about to give way. But then Nicole came running back, swinging another piece of wood and yelling that the police were on their way. The man finally stopped, glaring at me one last time before turning and disappearing into the night. The police arrived, but by then, he was long gone. We showed them the security footage, and they promised to keep an eye out for him. A few days later, we heard he had been arrested in a nearby town for stalking another woman. Nicole and I were both shaken by the experience. We quit our jobs shortly after and found safer work. We still talk about that night sometimes, grateful that we had each other's backs. But the memory of his twisted expression and the sound of him trying to break in still haunts me. Night shift at the morgue. I worked as a security guard at a local hospital in the morgue area. The place often experienced break-ins by a few addicts trying to experiment with some strange chemicals stored in the lab, and eventually it became their final resting place. Everything started like a normal night shift. Hygiene plays a crucial role in the hospital. To keep the place more sanitary, they recently installed automatic sliding doors that open when someone passes by, eliminating the need to touch any door handles. Every night at exactly 3:00 a.m., the door would open for a few seconds and then close again. I believe the door was programmed with some kind of time-based trigger. But when I contacted the door installation company, they told me that was impossible since the door was designed to open only when the sensor was activated or manually operated. So, this continued without explanation for a long time and became a routine for everyone watching the door open and close on the monitor every night. Tonight, I was on shift alone because my colleague was sick, and there wasn't enough time to find a temporary replacement on such short notice. I was no stranger to danger and didn't worry about working alone at night. The security monitors showed only 2 cameras, one facing the control room and another at the far end of the hallway looking toward the morgue entrance. When the clock struck 3:00 a.m., I did what every night guard on duty would do. I started watching the screen, As usual, the door moved, but honestly, I still got chills sometimes from the sudden rush of cold air every time the door opened. Suddenly, the door remained open. I thought it was a screen glitch, but the lights on the door were still flashing. I waited a few minutes, but I soon realized I had to go down the hallway because the morgue door was strictly prohibited from being left open. As I walked down the hallway, the cold air blew against me, and I thought it would be even colder when I reached the morgue. I had hoped that the door might have closed by the time I got there, but just as I saw on the monitor, the door was indeed still open, and the camera was functioning normally. I tried waving my hand in front of the sensor, but it was useless. The door didn't budge. I reluctantly considered my next option, which was to check the sensors from the inside. As I turned around to look down the hallway, the door finally closed. I felt my hair stand on end as a strange quietness settled in a sensation like someone was standing right behind me. Out of curiosity, I went back to the monitor. I decided to rewind the security footage to the moment I approached the door to see if I could spot anything unusual. And what I saw was something I shouldn't have witnessed. There was a girl standing in front of the door behind me. I couldn't clearly see her face because of her long black hair and the white dress she was wearing. She just stood there smiling, staring at me with one eye. To this day, I still can't explain it, as I had just been there and hadn't seen anyone. It wasn't until I checked the other camera that faced the entrance to the control room that I truly shuddered, and I still have nightmares about it to this day. Due to a mysterious power surge, most of the data on the drive was completely corrupted. I stared at the blank screen, my mind reeling. The events of that night played over and over in my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still in the room, watching from the shadows. Every night, as I try to sleep, when the clock strikes 3:00 a.m., I can still feel the chill in the air, the weight of invisible eyes on my back, and the quiet whisper of the girl who was there.
Horror story of school locker. Sure, here is the translation of your text into English. A few days ago, Anna attended a party. The police showed up, and everyone scattered. Anna took a shortcut, fell into the river, and has been missing since. When they found her, she was no longer alive. She had passed away. The principal asked Kat to clean out Anna's locker. It had been a week since the funeral, and ANA's mother still hadn't come to collect her belongings. Kat nodded, feeling both curious and fearful. Anna had been one of the popular girls, always surrounded by friends. The news of her sudden death had shocked everyone. She wasn't like that. I was quite shy and had almost no friends. She approached the locker, its dull gray door a stark contrast to the vibrant memories of its owner. She twisted the combination lock, and with a metallic click, it opened. Inside, the locker was neatly organized. It only took her a few minutes to scoop Anna's belongings into her backpack. There were just a few textbooks, a small makeup pouch, and a neatly folded scarf remaining. As she reached in to gather the items, a strange gust of wind brushed against the back of her neck, sending a shiver down her spine. She glanced around, but the hallway was empty. She picked up the scarf, its silk smooth and cool. She remembered that Anna always wore this scarf like a treasured possession. It seemed that she really loved it. Suddenly, a whisper echoed in the confined space, telling her that the scarf was beautiful and would suit her perfectly. Her heart pounded. Perhaps she had imagined it. She continued cleaning the locker, but the unease lingered. As she closed the door, The whisper came again, more insistent this time, telling her,
Wear it always, and everyone will admire you.
how could she refuse? Even as goosebumps rose on her skin, she nodded and tied the scarf around her neck. Although it was silk, it felt heavy, pressing down on her bones. Kat looked up at the mirror and almost screamed. She didn't just look like Anna in that moment. She was Anna. The scarf somehow warped her skin, transforming her face. She pulled with all her strength, but it wouldn't come off. Her elbow struck the mirror, causing it to bleed. Then a voice whispered,
It's okay.
and assured her that everyone would love her. She decided to take a chance and see if it was true. Days passed, and she began to notice changes. People who had never acknowledged her before started to smile and greet her. The popular crowd invited her to sit with them at lunch. Kat enjoyed the attention she was receiving. She attributed the change to her makeover and the confidence boost from wearing Anna's scarf, so she didn't believe it too much. But the whispers started again and wouldn't stop. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw Anna's reflection staring back at her, smiling that familiar, haunting smile. It was as if Anna was still there, watching, waiting. Day by day, the whispers grew into screams in her head. Panic set in. She stumbled, knocking over her bedside lamp. As she went to school, she always avoided that locker because she felt a dark presence looming around Anna's locker. Kat's breath caught in her throat as she tried to pull the scarf off, but it tightened, choking her. Then a voice echoed in her head, asking what she was doing. The next day, she decided to return the scarf to Anna's locker, hoping to break the curse. When she approached the locker, the hallway was eerily silent. She unlocked it and placed the scarf inside. Before she could close the door, the scarf flew up and wrapped around her neck again. She fell to the floor, the scarf tightening more and more. Her vision darkened, and the last thing she saw was her own reflection in the locker mirror, her face now twisted into a smile that wasn't hers. A few days later, students whispered about Kat's disappearance. Her locker remained shut, and the smell of decay began to permeate the hallway. The principal and the janitor tried to open it, but the new lock seemed fused shut. Only Kat had the combination. One evening, as the janitor was mopping the empty hallway, he heard a faint whisper.
Wear it, and everyone will admire you.
The janitor glanced around, but saw nothing. He shook his head, thinking it was his imagination. But as he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in a nearby window. He saw Kat's face staring back at him, a silk scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, smiling that haunting, familiar smile. The janitor gradually turned pale and was so frightened that his heart felt like it was going to jump out of his chest. He ran out of there as fast as he could and immediately went to the police station to report what he had just witnessed. At first, he thought it was just an illusion, but when he linked it with Anna's departure and Kat's disappearance, it was really a coincidence, as if there was some kind of curse. Sometime later, the police came and took the cabinet out of the school. The mystery of Kat's disappearance and the scarf remains a mystery that no one wants to talk about.
Nightmare neighbor. The old, tall apartment building stood under the dim glow of the streetlights. It was late, and most of the windows were dark. Rena stood outside the building, staring up at the second floor where her apartment was. She had lived here for a few months, and the place had always been quiet. Until Arthur moved in next door. Rena's apartment was at the end of the hallway on the second floor. and the trip to take out the trash usually took only a few minutes. But tonight, she felt eyes on her. As she was about to turn the corner at the end of the hall, there he was. Arthur was standing by his door, as if waiting for her. He always found a reason to talk and stand too close to her. She kept her head down, mumbled a quick greeting, and brushed past him toward the stairs. This time, he said nothing. A chill ran down Rena's spine. Something was different tonight, something that made her more uneasy than before. Rena stepped into her apartment and quickly shut the door. She took a moment to calm herself, telling herself she was overreacting. She turned off the lights in the living room, planning to head to bed and watch some TV. It was late, and she was tired but not quite ready to sleep. As she passed the broom closet, she heard something, a faint sound, like a rustling from inside. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze, staring at the closet door. With trembling hands, she reached for the closet handle. She hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her not to open it, but she had to. She couldn't just leave it. She pulled the door open. Arthur was standing there, in her closet. For a split second, time seemed to stop. He was just standing there, staring at her, unblinking, with a twisted smile on his face. She gasped, stumbling backward. Her heart raced as panic rose inside her. He stepped forward, crawling out of the closet like a predator closing in on its prey. She ran into the bedroom, slamming the door shut, but she didn't have time to lock it. The door flew open, and Arthur was right there, his face wild. She dashed for the bathroom, her final place of refuge. She slammed the door just as Arthur reached the bedroom. Her hands fumbled with the lock. Rena pressed her back against the cold bathroom wall. Her breath came in sharp gasps as Arthur pounded on the door, trying to break through. The thin wooden door was all that separated her from the man who had been stalking her for weeks. His sick grin etched into her mind. Thankfully, she had brought her phone with her. She gripped it tightly, her fingers trembling as she spoke to the police. Her voice was barely a whisper, fear choking her words. Arthur slammed the door again, the wood splintering under the force. Rena knew it wouldn't hold much longer. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. She held her breath, pressing her ear to the door, straining to hear any sound. Was he gone? Had he given up? Arthur stood outside the bathroom door, his breathing ragged, his eyes wild with anticipation. His patience was wearing thin. His hand hovered over the doorknob before he stepped back. Glancing at Rena's bedroom, he knew she was cornered, with nowhere to go. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, shiny knife. His fingers tightened around the handle, and his eyes narrowed. With a single powerful kick, the bathroom door splintered apart. The door burst open, and Arthur lunged inside, his eyes wide and feral. She backed up until she was almost against the wall. She screamed for him to stay away, but Arthur didn't stop. He lunged at her, grabbing her arm in a grip so tight it would leave bruises. Rena tried to pull away, but he was too strong. Pain shot down her spine as he twisted her wrist, pinning it to the wall. Her phone slipped from her hand, crashing to the floor. Arthur's face was now only a few centimeters from hers, whispering threats because she always ignored him in the hallway. Rena struggled, trying to break free, but he pulled her closer, tightening his grip. His knife slashed through the air, grazing her arm. She gasped as a sharp pain cut through her skin, blood trickling down. The sound of sirens tore through the night, growing louder as the police raced toward the apartment building. Flashing lights reflected off the windows, like a beacon of hope in the suffocating darkness. Inside, Rena's vision blurred with panic and pain. He shoved her against the wall again, laughing maniacally as he brought the knife closer to her throat. Her body screamed for escape, Her free hand groped blindly along the counter near the sink, desperately searching for anything she could use to defend herself. She grabbed a glass soap bottle and, without thinking, smashed it over Arthur's head. The glass shattered, and he staggered back, momentarily dazed. Arthur staggered. The knife slipped from his hand and fell to the floor. Rena did not wait. She rushed out the door, holding her throbbing arm that was bleeding from the cut he made. She ran out of the bathroom and into the living room, her mind screaming for escape. But Arthur wasn't far behind. Stunned, but enraged, he grabbed the knife again and charged toward her, blood streaming down his face from where the glass had struck him. The police burst through the front door of the apartment complex, racing up the stairs to the second floor. They knew they had to act quickly. Rena reached the living room, but her legs buckled beneath her, sending her crashing to the floor. She could feel Arthur's looming presence, approaching with the knife in hand. His eyes were now filled with rage, the twisted delight gone. He reached for her, grabbing her hair. Rena winced in pain, trying to get up, her body screaming for help. Arthur growled, his voice low and venomous. "There's nowhere left to run, girl." Just as he raised the knife again, the apartment door burst open with a loud crash. The police swarmed into the apartment, guns drawn. "Drop the weapon," one of them shouted, their voices slicing through the tension. Arthur hesitated, giving Rena the opening she needed. She kicked his leg hard, causing him to cry out in pain. She ran toward the police, gasping for breath, blood dripping from her arm. But the nightmare was finally over. Rena sat on the edge of the ambulance, her mind still reeling, her body in shock. She watched as the police loaded Arthur into the back of their car. The flashing lights of the police car faded into the night as they drove away. The ghostly tape. In a small dorm room, a typical living space for a college student, cluttered with textbooks and clothes. Each desk lamp serves as the only real source of light. Lai and Khan, two female students, are sitting on an old carpet next to the TV stand, preparing to watch a movie for their weekend break. The TV is old, seemingly from the 90s, still equipped with a VHS player. Beside the TV is an old cardboard box, filled with random tapes and outdated electronics. The box came from a trip they had taken earlier that day to a vintage thrift store. Back at the dorm, they rummaged through the tapes, laughing at the absurdity of their choices: old sitcoms, instructional videos, forgotten movies. Then, they found a plain black VHS tape. It had no markings except for a single word, hastily scrawled in faded red ink on the label: "Don't." The label was torn and dirty, as though it had passed through countless hands before. They hesitated for a moment, but curiosity quickly won them over. Lai slid the tape into the VHS player. The TV crackled to life with a sharp, screeching sound. The picture was grainy, distorted, and flickered with a buzzing noise. The first image appeared, a dilapidated house in the middle of a dark, dense forest. The camera shook, as if it was being held in someone's hand. There was no sound except the rustling of leaves. The house is old and almost collapsed. As the camera moved closer, the creaking of the front door opening slowly filled the silence. Inside the house, the rooms were empty, covered in dust, old furniture draped with sheets. The air grew heavy, tense. In a long and narrow hallway, at the end was a door, slightly open. Then the screen flashed for a moment. What was happening was quite difficult to understand. The tension of the tape seemed to gradually seep into their space. A few seconds later, the camera was now in the basement, standing before a large circular symbol carved into the floor. Strange runes were etched into the surface. As they stared at it, they felt like they couldn't breathe. Then, a loud crash. and the screen jerked toward the far end of the basement. There, in the darkness, something moved. The two girls froze in place. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that were too long and thin. Its face was hidden in the shadows, but its hollow eyes stared into the room. A faint whisper, barely audible, began to play through the TV speakers. But the sound quickly grew louder, more persistent, almost as if it was speaking directly to them. They seemed to be hypnotized. Lai couldn't take her eyes off the screen. Whispering like a mantra, Lai stood up and began to lose control of her body. Kan called her name, but it didn't seem to reach her ears. Lai walked towards the TV, eyes glassy, body stiff. She could feel Kan's eyes on her, but she couldn't stop. The figure on the screen seemed to pull Lai closer, its long, bony fingers stretched out as if wanting to catch her. Kan gasped, backing away. Kan suddenly realized that Lai was moving like a puppet on the TV. Lai continued to move like the figure on the screen, her body twisting unnaturally, her joints cracking. Kan could only scream in desperation. Lai continued to move as shown on the screen, her body contorted in a strange way, her joints cracking. Kan could only scream in vain. Lai's eyes began to roll back and a sick, twisted smile appeared on her face. Lai turned her head and approached Kan with her arms outstretched, her fingers slowly gripping her shoulders as if wanting to harm her. Kan, terrified, tried to reach out with trembling hands to stop the tape, but failed. The image on the screen mirrored every detail of what was happening in the room. Everything felt like something had stepped out of the TV. The long, spindly fingers stretched with gray, skeletal skin. The figure moved slowly toward them, its joints cracking with every step, as if just existing in this world was painful. And then the door burst open. It was Jay, our other roommate. The sudden interruption sent a shockwave through me, breaking the trance. Lai staggered backward, her arms falling to her sides. The figure retreated into the shadows with an ear-piercing screech that only Lai and Kan could hear. Then the figure was gone. We collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, looking at each other in shock. The only thought in their minds was to get out and never look back. They scrambled to their feet, fleeing the room without a second glance, leaving the cursed tape behind in front of a confused Jay. The noise on the TV was distorted, and the final image showed that shadowy figure coming from the basement. It thought it was screaming like it was sealed again. Maybe it almost succeeded in escaping, and maybe Lai and Kan would be the replacements. Abandoned house on Halloween. The dim light of Halloween decorations danced on the walls, casting strange shadows that seemed to come alive. This was the day I had always looked forward to. My friends were out gathering candy, but I was too anxious to join them this year. As I stared into the flickering light of the TV, I couldn't shake the feeling that this Halloween would be different. Finally, I gathered the courage to step outside. I trudged down the street, admiring the carved pumpkins and spooky decorations adorning the houses. I approached a house at the end of the block that I had never noticed before. The house looked abandoned, with peeling paint on the walls and overgrown weeds. A shiver ran down my spine, but curiosity drew me closer. As I stepped onto the porch, I noticed a flickering light inside. My heart raced. Should I knock? The porch creaked beneath my feet, and I took a deep breath before raising my hand to the door. Before I could knock, the door swung open on its own, revealing a pitch-black entrance. The smell of mildew and rot hit my nose, and I hesitantly called out to see if anyone was home. But it was completely silent, so I cautiously stepped inside. Darkness stretched across the walls, and I could see old furniture covered in dust sheets. I spotted an old pumpkin lantern flickering in the corner, its flame casting dancing shadows. I felt a strange pull toward the back of the house, where I saw a flickering light coming through a window. I cautiously made my way down the hallway, the floor creaking beneath my feet. My heart raced as I approached the doorway, the light growing brighter. But as I reached for the doorknob, a sudden chill ran down my spine. I paused, sensing an unsettling energy in the air. Then, without warning, I heard a rustling behind me. I turned to see the door I had just passed through slowly closing, as if someone or something was pushing it shut. Panic surged within me. I forced the door open, only to reveal a cluttered living room shrouded in darkness. And then, there he was. An old man sat in a rocking chair, dressed in tattered clothes, with a long beard and wild hair. His eyes sunk deep into his face. He rocked slowly back and forth, making the chair creak in the silence, thickening the atmosphere. I felt a wave of fear wash over me, but I couldn't take my eyes off his movements. As I took a step back, wanting to retreat, the door slammed shut behind me. Panic surged within me. I was trapped in this old, eerie house with a strange, terrifying man. Suddenly, the old man spoke, his voice hoarse and deep. "You've come for the treats, haven't you?" My throat tightened as I nodded slowly, fear coursing through me. I could hardly make out his features in the dim light. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of something that looked like candy, extending his hand toward me, saying it was specially for me. But something felt off. It looked dark and uninviting. Just then, I heard a crash from another room, followed by the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. My instincts kicked in, and I knew I needed to get out. I dashed toward the front door, my heart racing as I pulled on the doorknob. It wouldn't budge. I twisted and struggled to open it in desperation. The old man's laughter echoed behind me, sending chills down my spine. "Stay a while. I have plenty of candy," he called, his voice dripping with malice. Panic surged within me as I pulled at the front door, but it stubbornly remained shut. The old man's laughter echoed around me, filling me with dread. I glanced back at him, the flickering lantern casting eerie shadows that made him appear even more terrifying. My mind raced with fear and desperation for a way out. I stepped back from the door and scanned the room for another exit. I spotted a window on the far side, partially obscured by tattered curtains. That was when he stood up. He took a step closer. "You shouldn't be here, kid." Ignoring him, I rushed toward the window, fear propelling me forward. I fumbled with the latch, my fingers trembling, but it was stuck tight. I felt tears welling up as if some unseen force was preventing me from escaping the darkness of this house. I glanced back at the old man, who was now only inches away, his smile widening with delight as he watched me trapped. In a moment of desperation, I looked back down the dark hallway that led further into the house. Perhaps there was another escape route. I dashed forward, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling of being watched. The flickering lantern behind me illuminated strange images painted on the walls, pictures of children, lost and weeping. My heart raced as I reached another door at the end of the hallway. With trembling hands, I pushed it open. The kitchen was eerily quiet, filled with the stench of decay and rot. I glanced around, searching for an exit. The back door appeared at the end, partially ajar, promising freedom. Just as I reached for the doorknob, I heard the unmistakable creak of floorboards behind me. I turned to see the old man stepping into the kitchen, blocking my only escape. His voice was hoarse as he stared at me. "We're just getting started." I threw myself against the door, desperate to escape. The door swung open, and I tumbled into the backyard. As I turned back after the fall, the terrifying face of the old man loomed before me. I felt breathless at the sight of him. Despite the pain from my fall, I didn't hesitate any longer. I bolted through the yard, glancing back to see the old man standing in the doorway, his figure framed by the dim light of the kitchen. I reached the fence surrounding the backyard, my mind racing. The only escape was over the tall wooden slats, but I had no time to hesitate. I climbed up, my fingers gripping the splintered wood, heart pounding as I launched myself over to the other side. I landed awkwardly in the neighbor's yard, rolling to my feet and sprinting into the street. Not only that, terror surged as I hit the ground. The neighbor's dog burst out, barking furiously as if it wanted to devour me. I panicked, crawling on the ground to escape this madness. I could hear nothing but the blood pounding in my ears as I ran onto the main road. The Halloween decorations lining the street now looked terrifying, their shadows stretching under the moonlight. I sprinted down the street, glancing back at the house, terrified the old man was watching me. I couldn't slow down. I needed to get home, to safety. Each breath became labored as I turned the corner, and the familiar sight of my house came into view. I burst through the gate and rushed to the front door, my fingers fumbling at the lock as I desperately tried to get inside. I flung the door open and stumbled into the safety of my home. Gasping for breath, heart pounding, I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it immediately and sliding down against the door. My mom was still at work, and the house felt eerily quiet. As I peered outside, a figure moved through the yard. My heart skipped a beat. I squinted, but thankfully it was just a neighbor walking their dog. I exhaled, relief flooding through me, but it didn't last long. As I lay in bed that night, darkness enveloped me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the old man was still out there, waiting in the shadows. Perhaps this Halloween would be one filled with terror for me. Horror story about a truck driver. I started driving trucks at the age of 25 and also encountered many strange cases on the road. I'm pretty sure I've encountered a few UFO while driving at night and occasionally encountered many strange drivers. The story I share with you today is the most horrifying and strange experience I have ever witnessed. In observation, I was 37 years old in 2009. That night was like most nights. I drove and listened to music on the radio, drinking some coffee to keep myself awake. The roads here are very deserted and covered in fog. Gradually, the fog got thicker and thicker, and I started thinking about whether I should pull over for a while or keep driving. I thought so, but in the end, I still chose to continue driving. At this time, there was no one on the country road, so it was probably safe to continue driving. To prevent bad situations from happening, such as an animal or something running across the road, I drove slowly. While I was concentrating on driving, I suddenly smelled something. I thought the smell of sodium carbonate was the worst smell I had ever smelled, but this smell is much worse. This smell quickly filled the inside of my truck. I quickly rolled up the window, but the smell didn't get much better. This horrible smell in my car, and I feel like I could vomit immediately. This smell mixed with the bones creates a disgusting smell. I think nothing can cause a more terrible stench than this. At the same time, I felt an uncomfortable feeling in my throat, that feeling when you want to vomit but have to hold back. Opened the car door and started vomiting. When I was done, I quickly covered my nose because the smell was still in the air. I got in the car and calmed myself down to start driving again. That's when I noticed something crossing the road. The figure was of a man, and he was limping. In addition to his limping gait, I also noticed that the man was wearing an old white button-down shirt and black slacks. I reminisced about the strange and bizarre cases I had encountered. I don't know what to do with that man. Finally, I decided to drive over to ask if he was okay and if he needed me to call for help. Before I drove up to him, I soon realized that 4 more people were coming out from the side of the road. They were all going in the same direction as the first man I saw. They all walked with a strange limp. They all wore old-fashioned peasant clothes. What I found most strange was that they didn't realize there was a big truck going on the other side of the road. I thought to myself, if these people needed help, they would definitely come towards me. However, they all continued to limp across the street, disappearing into the darkness and fog. I emphasized again that I was in the middle of the speedway, meaning there were no houses or anything around. Then another figure stepped out from the darkness and kept crossing the street. However, this figure is much shorter. I got out of my truck, but didn't go to that kid. I just stood there, staring at it. It didn't seem to pay any attention to me. It continued to cross the road. The boy's gait and the clothes he wore were as strange as the previous ones. Just as the boy was about to reach the other end of the street, I shouted,
Do you need any help?
The boy stopped and turned his head to face me. My heart sank as soon as. It is a body without a face. I cursed under my breath and stood there in fear. Then, it let out the most terrible scream I've ever heard, limping towards me but at a faster speed than before. I quickly got into the truck and slammed the door. The horrifying screams became more and more frequent, louder, and more people came out from the darkness. I quickly drove away from the boy, accelerating to get out of this place as soon as possible. During the escape, those people were approaching, all of them faceless. When I drove to a residential area, I stopped at a gas station. I just sat there in my truck because my mind and heart were still shaking. My mind was blank. This experience has opened up so many things to me. I understand that this world is really strange and there will always exist things that we never think about.